I've made several videos on the Panasonic S1H and I've expressed very bluntly what I think of the autofocus. If this is your first time here, I'll summarize my opinion. It sucks. Recently though, with the release of the Panasonic S5, Panasonic promised that all of their S-series cameras were going to get the same autofocus capabilities for video on the S5 via a firmware update. I'm a little behind on getting the firmware update on my camera since it was released in November, I believe, but I've gotten a few comments on some of those videos asking my opinion on the autofocus now since they have released this firmware update. Coincidentally, I was planning on making a comparison video all along. So in today's video, I'm going to be getting some footage pre-firmware update and compare it to that same footage post-firmware update and see if there is a significant improvement. Let's jump right in. My name's Dustin, your video tour guide, and remember to always keep your arms and legs inside your chairs at all times. No, seriously, someone told me they almost lost an arm. I guess I need to put a disclaimer in the description or something. Not responsible for lost limbs. Watch at your own risk. With that, sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Real quick, I have a Discord community of content creators like you that's growing, so if you enjoy this video and you would like to get more involved with the community, I have a link in the description that'll take you there. Before I show some of the tests, I wanted to be consistent with my previous video where I tested the autofocus on the S1H. In that video, I had the sensitivity and speed of the autofocus turned up all the way. Later in this video though, I did do some tests at different settings to see if there really was a difference between them. To save time in this video as well, I only shot these tests with the Panasonic 24-105 f4 lens. I didn't feel it necessary to shoot any of these tests on the Sigma because of the results from my previous videos. Basically, whatever we see here, you can expect the Sigma to perform worse than the Panasonic lenses. For the first shot, I started with Tyler walking to camera and walking away from camera. When we compare the two shots side by side, I would say there is definitely an improvement when he walks towards camera. But when he turns around and walks away, there might be a slight improvement, but I wouldn't say by much. I do have to mention though, post firmware update, I noticed when Tyler turns around, a box will appear on the back of his head, which makes me think that Panasonic has tried to improve the tracking on someone when they turn around. In my previous video, when I would follow someone who was facing away from camera, the camera didn't really know what to focus on. So that's a plus with this update. For this next shot, it's pretty similar, but I had Tyler walk past camera as I panned with him. I gotta say, I was pretty impressed with this shot. You can see a very big difference between the two shots. Pre-firmware, the focus is what we expect, but post-firmware update, I mean, it just tracked him super well. Before I get some comments talking about how the pre-firmware shot, the sun was up, and the post-firmware shot, the sun was down, and how that could have affected this test, you'll see later on that even with the sun down, the background was still backlit enough that it shouldn't have affected these tests. Moving on to this next shot, I was simulating as if you were filming someone walking and talking, and with these shots, we know that the S1H does an okay job with talking heads. So what I'm looking for here is the focus shifting, and has that improved with this new firmware update? I would say no, but I will talk more about the focus shifting later in this video. One thing that is funny is that when I shot the test of Tyler while walking from behind, the pre-firmware update stayed on the back of his head as well as the post-firmware update. Did Panasonic improve this with a previous firmware update? I don't know, but what's good is that it's definitely doing a better job at staying locked on to the back of his head. I also got similar results when I shot the profile shot of Tyler walking. On this next shot of me parallaxing around Tyler, this is where I mentioned that the extreme backlit shot of the sun shouldn't have affected these tests. As you're watching the pre-firmware update shot, I was pretty impressed actually. It did a really good job at tracking Tyler the whole time, even with the sun directly behind him. It maybe slightly went out of focus, but I think it was definitely more than an acceptable shot. When we watch the post firmware update test, we see a similar result. For this next shot, this is where things get a bit more dicey even with the post firmware update test. This is a hard shot to track since I'm moving forward as Tyler walks towards the camera as well. I tested out the touch to focus feature as well to see if these focus racks are more pleasing, but I would say there isn't a big improvement there as well. It does that thing that contrast-based AF does and finds where it needs to focus, but then double checks really quick if it's in focus and then locks on to where it needs to be. You know what I'm talking about if you've used this camera. When it comes to focus shifting, I wanted to see if there was an improvement. Plus, I wanted to double check if we would get the same results in an extreme backlit scenario. For the most part, on the pre and post firmware updates, it's staying in focus on Tyler decently without shifting randomly to the background, but the focus shifting, you'll notice if you look up at the tree branches, it really hasn't improved. Again, I will talk about that a bit later. From here on out, I don't have any pre-firmware update footage to compare, but I felt like I needed to do some more tests with this new firmware update. So I did the same thing I did before and pretended like I was filming a talking head. I put my hands over my eyes and move around a lot just to see what would happen. I'd say that I got similar results that I got in my previous video doing a test like this. I did forget to mention that in my previous video, I shot everything with the aperture wide open at f1.4. In this video, we're still wide open, but we're at an f4. I kind of talked about how you could probably shoot at a higher f-stop to try and combat the focus shifting, but I think we just confirmed in these tests, including the ones of Tyler, that the focus shifting isn't going away, or is it? Like I mentioned, I wanted to see how changing the autofocus settings would affect the autofocus, if at all. So I messed around with the settings and I noticed that when I change the AF sensitivity, that does help reduce the focus shifting. I also messed around with the focus speed, and I'm not gonna lie, I think the default setting of 0 and 0 looks pretty good. It's a nice balance of keeping me decently in focus without all the ugly shiftiness, because you'll notice when I turn the settings all the way down, it has a much harder time keeping up with me. I've had some people mention to me in the comments as well that if you shoot at Super 35 at 60 FPS, that will kind of help with the autofocus and it'll do a better job. But honestly, I didn't see a huge difference. But I did only do one test shot, so it's possible this can help. To finish this thing off, I shot a bunch of random B-roll to see if the autofocus had any improvements in this department. And I did have to fight the autofocus to get it to do what I wanted, but in my brief tests, it did feel like there was an improvement. So now, what are my thoughts? Would I say there is an improvement with autofocus? I can honestly say yes, there is an improvement. Would I say that this camera has good autofocus though? Well, it's tough to say. Even with the autofocus improvement, I still have a hard time trusting the autofocus all the time. The focus shifting can also be a big distraction if you notice it. Probably the most important discovery we made though was that the focus settings can help improve the focus shifting. One thing I have to mention as well, a lot of my videos on this channel where I'm talking to camera like this are shot with the autofocus on the S1H on a Sigma lens with the aperture wide open. Right now I'm shooting on the A7S III, but that doesn't mean I've had the camera go out of focus while I'm talking. You may have just not seen it since I put B-roll over the top, or I cut it out since it was not a good take. I've also used the autofocus on a talking head on set, and I've had it shift out of focus for a few seconds, then come back. That was enough for me to stick to using manual focus for now. Who knows? I may give it another go with this firmware update just to see if it really is more reliable. The nice thing about this video though is that you don't have to choose to have or to not have this firmware update because it's free. So if you own a Panasonic S-Series camera, make sure that that bad boy is up to date because I do think that the firmware update is worth it for that slight autofocus improvement. That's all for this video. Hopefully you guys found it helpful. If you did, be sure to leave her the old triple thumbs up. And if you support what I do, be sure to check out the links in the description. You can also support the channel by hitting the subscribe button and the bell button to be notified of future uploads. Until that next video though, happy filming.
People of YouTube, welcome. This is Christmas Eve. We're out here in middle of Utah, and it is 26 degrees outside. And we've got a wonderful dog accompanying us.
It's okay.
Do you want to play?
He's probably afraid of the camera.
It's like, what is this?
My dog's afraid of my camera. Oh, what? What is this thing? What is this thing? What is it?
It's like, oh, no, get away from me.
My dog's afraid of this thing too, so.